So Gordian III, to me, is almost like a mini Alexander. His reign is fairly stable compared to the previous few years and the Year of Six Emperors. You are starting to see the elements of what's going to happen in the next few decades. Barbarians are starting to penetrate into the frontiers. The political situation has managed to stabilize itself in the capital, but you are starting to get elements of rebellion. Historians have found potential usurpers during his reign. Some of the evidence isn't that good for it, so it's a bit of a question mark. But I think
there is a Sibelianus, maybe. I think there are coins attesting to someone called Sibelianus, but I think that's...
Yeah. The cracks are starting to appear. But with Timotheus, who was the Praetorian prefect, who was in charge for much of Gordian's reign, you do have some return to stability. And for the 5 years that Gordian was emperor, which 5 years might not seem like a long time, but in the 3rd century, that's a very long time for an emperor, he is relatively successful. And also his campaign against Persia is a little bit better than Severus's. But like Severus, it's his downfall. For Alexander, it was the beginning of his downfall, and for Gordian, he died during the campaign. It's not exactly certain how he died. Some people say he was murdered by Philip. Some people say he died of an illness or on his way back from campaign, or murdered by... I think it was... One person says he was murdered by a secretary. There's a whole bunch of...
Yeah.
No one's sure how Gordian died, but he did. Seems to be the impression from the Roman historians. And presumably a few stories got back, which ended up in the histories. I think he was a mediocre emperor like Alexander Severus. It's quite interesting, his Antoniniani, which are silver coins which are worth 2 denarii, have very good strikes, minted a lot of coins, and very high quality ones.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, so his coins were particularly high quality then.
In the strike, they are. I don't know about the metal content itself, but every Gordian coin Antoninianus I've seen has been fairly well made, and the coins in the 3rd century just go down the tube in terms of their quality in both metal content and the strike, so
yes,
it would be something I'd have to look into more. But just on face value observance, maybe there's something there.
Some sound economic management.
Yeah, maybe there's something to it. Yeah, there's also that aspect to Gordian, which I find interesting and makes him a bit more worthier than some of the other emperors we've discussed so far.
Yes, I mean it's an interesting aspect to consider, and I think he's better than anyone we've considered so far. As you say, so he ruled for the period a decent amount of time with no major issues until the very end.
Yeah.
So he was a teen when he came to power. So he was only 13 when he came to power. And I think as a teenage ruler, he did a better job than Alexander, I think. We know, for example, under Alexander, as you mentioned earlier, the Praetorians killing the Praetorian prefect Ulpian, this celebrated jurist. There's no incidents like that as far as we can tell. And he starts to put a lot of trust into Timotheus, his father-in-law / Praetorian prefect. We know that he had a very illustrious career as an equestrian, this guy, and was very talented. We know from an inscription that he had a long career as a logistical officer, logistical chief in the provinces. So he was a very important person to have when you plan on going to war with Persia and ultimately invading Persia, which is what Gordian ultimately did. I think he was right to put trust in Timotheus. The Battle of Rosina, when Timotheus and Gordian defeated Shapur, is a particularly notable thing to consider because it's literally the only time that Shapur is reliably attested as losing a battle in the field. And actually, I mean, we don't have many details on these other campaigns, but as far as we can tell, against anyone, because Shapur was very busy also on his northern and eastern frontiers, from what we can tell from numismatics and inscriptions. But he was sort of this, for the period, an unstoppable king, and Timotheus and Gordian did win this victory and proceeded to retake, or either had already started retaking, Nisibis and Carrhae, these cities that had been captured by the Persians in 238 during the year of the Six Emperors. We also know, there's a good case to be made that they also timed it very well. On the one hand, you could say that, well, it took them kind of a long time to counterattack against the Persians, and maybe that's a bad look. But actually, when you look at what else is going on in the Persian Empire at that time, Shapur became the sole king of the empire in 241. And we know from a chronicle that claims that when Shapur became king, he basically had to rush to the Caspian Sea region, because the thing that I think can be underestimated is the Sasanians were they'd only been in power. It hadn't been 20 years yet.
Yeah.
And so with, the big daddy of the empire, Ardashir, suddenly dead, quite naturally, certain vassals believed, just like the Parthians, that they could break free. And we know that Shapur had to travel to the Caspian Sea in the early 240s to deal with Hyrcanians and Gorganians and Daylamites, who had these, elite mercenary heavy infantry that the Persians used. They rebelled as well. And
I've heard the Sassanid Persian Empire described as a kind of federation. It's an anachronistic term, but it's not quite the unified empire the Roman Empire is, with like a center around the emperor and then all of the administrative provinces. You've got a far more decentralized, as you said earlier, and almost more autonomous state where the King of Kings really has to have his satraps on his side to get things done. And if he manages to annoy the Parthians, then a good portion of his empire is out of the works. It's a feudal empire, and that's one of the reasons why Shapur can never really, he never really tries to either, but he's trying to conquer places in he wants to conquer Armenia and Upper Mesopotamia, but whenever he invades Syria or Asia Minor, he's conducting raids, and he's never trying to hold Antioch, because it seems that he physically can't with the armies that he has, because you can only get the cataphract, the sort of the Savaran knightly class of the Sasanians, to spend only so long far away from home in Roman Syria. And so he is more limited than the Romans in that sense. And he does go some way, compared with the Parthians, to centralizing power. We know that there were various vassal kings attested on coins that ceased to be attested by the 260s. And it looks as though he has implanted, he set up these governors who are members of the Sasanian royal family in places like Merv and Arachosia and Bactria. So he's putting the effort in to centralize his power, but it's certainly still a more feudal power and a more decentralized power than Rome is. I think, to the credit of Gordian and Timotheus, they presumably got word of what was going on in the Caspian Sea region and decided that was the time to make a move. And so probably Shapur had to put down these rebellions, return to Upper Mesopotamia, and then fight a battle on the back foot against Gordian and Timotheus. Ultimately went badly, because Timotheus then died and Gordian pushed into Lower Mesopotamia, and then Shapur defeated him at the Battle of Myzica, which is a battle that is strikingly absent from Latin sources, that they don't really, sort of just isn't mentioned, perhaps a little bit covered up. It is the huge humiliation of the end result of the war, which is the death of Gordian and Praetorian Prefect, and also Philip the Arab having to pay this enormous 500,000. One could imagine it's just the huge humiliation of this campaign, despite having started so well. And also the Roman army was basically trapped by this battle.
Because Philip was basically having to pay a ransom. Yeah, it is. It's like it's the same situation as the Julian situation. It seems Philip was basically having to ransom his way out of Persian territory. The defeat itself does seem to have been a serious problem when it happened.
So where would you put Gordian?
I will also add, he does also seem to have handled, from what little we know of the northern frontier at this time, he seems to have handled that fairly well, because his reign is also when we first hear about the Goths. And we know that the Goths sacked a city on the Black Sea. I think it was Histria. The governor in the area, Monophilus, who was the same person who defended Aquileia against Maximinus, he paid off the Goths, but then defeated the Carpi, who thought they could do the same thing as the Goths. And so it seems, I mean, it's not a brilliant look, paying off the Goths, but it seems that they're sort of keeping things under control in that region in a way that later on it wouldn't be the case. I think, yeah, the whole death of Gordian issue is a fascinating one. I actually favour it's a matter of debate, of course, but I sort of favour the Byzantine version, which seems to stem from a Greek historical tradition in its original form, now lost, that he fell off his horse, busted his hip, and then the wound festered and he died on the march back. Which, and I kind of...
or something.
Yeah, and I favour that because it's so banal. I mean, relative to the other options, because... So it sort of seems like, why would anyone really make that up? I mean, it fits with what we know. It's made clear that it happened during a battle. We can presume that's the Battle of Mysica, the defeat. Which I guess is a good look for Gordian, because it suggests that he was sort of in the thick of it, despite only being 19 by that point in time. But... I mean, the idea that Philip, for example, killed Gordian, I find a difficult one to believe, because I think Philip, well, he set up, we know from Ammianus that he set up this large cenotaph for Gordian on the outskirts of Persian territory to honour Gordian, and he had his body transported back to Rome and he deified him. All things that would seem not politically astute when you're doing this while still leading the army that apparently killed him. I find a strange disconnect. Again, Philip has he does have a bad time in the sources to a degree because, again, he's an equestrian emperor. He took power in clearly circumstances where no one had a lot of reliable information going around about it. In enemy territory, and he naturally came under suspicion in a way that, when we stop and think about it, perhaps it's an unfair amount of suspicion. I suppose I'd consider him okay. Yeah, I think I'd put him a little bit ahead of mediocre, just because I think there are a few things he did distinctly better than Severus Alexander, while also, in the end, losing a battle that had a significant effect on the Roman Empire and his successor, Philip.